Even though I've spent most of my career as a professional educator, I did my doctoral work at Stanford University in the field of history. And one of the things that continually strikes me as a professional historian is that over the last 15 years, as I've been really fully engaged in the intersection between technology developments and education, so much of the discourse is very presentist and lacks a matrix or a historical context. So one of the things I'd like to do this morning is to provide my attempt at a big history contextualization of the inflection point through which we're living. Because after all, if this is not an historical process, then what is it? And understanding the historical trajectories into where we are today, at least over a 200-year span. I mean, we could go back to the Neolithic, which I think would actually be instructive. But for the sake of ease today, we'll just focus on the last 200 years. Gandhi used to describe going to the ashram for a retreat as akin to pulling back on a bow so that he could then go further into the world as an arrow. And I think that that is also true of taking a moment to reflect on our historical trajectory. It can send our vision forward with more accuracy and depth. So I'm going to begin with a big history perspective. I'm then going to touch upon what I think is the potential for the workforce that we could build in the coming quarter century. And I say potential because there are myriad contingencies. And we make choices that shape those contingencies toward, hopefully, human optimizing outcomes. And then I'm going to end with some ideas about how education can, must, and is to be changed. I do want to also take Sarah Frame's wise suggestion to heart and try to contain my remarks within half an hour so that there's time for Q&A. I look forward to your questions. Now, in the larger historical narrative, successive technology revolutions have been removing the preponderance of workers steadily away from direct production of material needs toward human inputs on our social and interior needs. I think that's fairly self-evident, but it's nonetheless profound to remind ourselves of what is a truism. I would submit to you that in the United States over the last 2 centuries, we have transitioned through 3 technology-driven transformations from one particular type of economy to another, and that they are periodized roughly as having gone through a century and a half century, and now a quarter century. So you can see the steady quickening and time conflation of the changes through which we're living. I think that's relevant because there are many people who say today, well, we have seen these changes in the past, right? We've lived through this, and new industries were created where none were known in that sector before. And so we've always been able to replace obsoleted jobs with new jobs. That is true. And we probably can hope that that will continue to be the case. But I would submit to you that velocity quickening can have qualitative implications. And so what we were able to accomplish in a 150-year time span, now we're looking at having to accomplish in a 25-year time span on a comparable scale. And that means that we are at a very heightened need for proactive, enlightened, historically informed governance, educational transformation, workforce development. So I would submit that for the sake of ease, let's think of the agricultural economy shifting to the industrial economy as transpiring roughly from 1817 to 1967. And that's just convenient because it's exactly 150 years. And I didn't pick them randomly, however. In 1817, that was the first shovel in the ground for the Erie Canal, which many people would see as the beginning of government-informed industrial process in the Northeast. And if you know the history of Rochester, New York, and the burned-over district, I would love to give my favorite peroration on the burned-over district for 2 hours, and so please stop by later today. In 1967, I selected because that was the year of the gold crisis, which, again, many economic historians see as the beginning of the decline of America as the hegemonic industrial production power. And so certainly in 1817, well over half of Americans, around 80 to 90% of Americans were engaged in agrarian production, whereas in 1967, well over half of Americans were engaged in industrial production of material goods. Now, let's bear in mind that while we have seen this before and we have lived through a transition like this before, it wasn't without its convulsive aspects. So again, one of the things that I think is sort of masked in the comments, as true as they are, that we've been through these types of transitions before, is not only the fact that we're conflating the velocity of change with accelerating exponential technology development, but the other aspect is that it's not as though you just sit in a phlegmatic insouciance and watch it unfold, right? It is disruptive in the extreme. And so, for instance, if I could cite a few possible examples, many historians have argued that the American Civil War, which per capita was still the costliest war in terms of bloodshed in American history, and more Americans died in the American Civil War, even though we had a small population at the time, than in all other American wars combined until Vietnam, that was actually a result, or at least profoundly driven, by an agrarian slave-based economic system posited against an industrializing free labor-based industrial system. I would also submit to you that the populist movement was an agrarian revolution against the industrializing East and North. And that remains to this day the most powerful protest movement in American history. And I'm not even mentioning the union struggles from the 1880s onward. So again, we had a century and a half to go through this transition, but I think I've named a few indicators that it was anything but smooth for the people living through it. From 1967 to 2017, rather, a very I almost went backwards, PDQ box birth dates, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, Google it, it's fun. At any rate, 1967 to 2017, a nice convenient 50-year period, I would submit that we've gone from an industrial base to a service sector economy, where now the majority of Americans are providing services to each other. And I want to point out that there have been some studies that are often cited about the transitions through which we're going. And I want to play with those for a minute. But I would first submit to you that the next quarter century, just quarter century, is going to see a comparable transition from a service sector economy to, well, what? I'm going to try to suggest what I think that can and should be. But first of all, there have been two major studies that are continually cited in the media about what we can anticipate in the coming years. One is from Oxford University, the James Martin School, the Oxford Martin School that I was very involved in the early years of its founding. And 2015, I think it was 2014, they came out with a study that said over the next 20 years, they were studying specifically the American economy, 47% of jobs will be eliminated in the next 20 years. Often juxtaposed to that in the media are the work of some folks at McKinsey who said that over the coming years, we can anticipate that 60% of jobs will have 30% of skills eliminated by automation. Okay, and that's often juxtaposed to say, well, there's a much milder scenario here that's coming out of McKinsey. I would submit to you that reporters, some of whom are very close friends of mine, are very busy people, and they don't have the time to read the footnotes and the methodological underpinnings of studies, because in fact, these two studies are very consonant. They're just asking different questions or positing different foundational axiomatic assumptions. So let me play with that for just a moment. The McKinsey study assumes that there is, just for the sake of argument, zero technology change from today forward in 2015. That's a rather unusual assumption. But they're saying, look, we can't prognosticate into the future, so let's just assume that there is no technology innovation, and let's only look out 10 years, and then ask ourselves, with today's technology and nothing new, over just 10 years, how many jobs would be eliminated? Well, of course, you're going to come up with a milder outcome if those are your assumptions. And it's a perfectly accurate projection that says, over a 10-year period, we'll see 60% of jobs with 30% of skills eliminated. That's still pretty disruptive if you think about assuming no technology change. The Oxford study said, let's assume that we're going to see a continuing pace, perhaps even an acceleration along the curves that we've seen in recent years over the next 20 years, and look out over 2 decades. And they conclude, and I think also accurately, that 47% of current jobs will no longer exist for human labor in a 20-year period. So where are we going to be going from the service economy? Now, I would submit to you that the service economy includes, importantly, many of the jobs that people think are secure because they went to college for them. The service economy isn't just somebody who's on the other side of a retail counter, right? And it's not just somebody who drives a vehicle, although think about how disrupted. I would not want to have my career dependent upon driving a vehicle today. But it also includes doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, financial analysts, people who are wearing a white collar to work and who went to many years of college to be in the professions. They are going to be eviscerated in the next quarter century. And they're going to be very angry and caught by surprise if we don't prepare properly. Now, the danger, of course, is that if we assume that the current distribution of labor is some approximation to a bell curve in our society, what we're going to see is that the middle of that curve is what's hollowed out in that 40%, 47% elimination. And we can discuss this in the Q&A section, elaborate on it. But if you're familiar with the Moravich paradox, then it's going to actually start in the higher end of the middle of that curve with the white collar labor, and then move toward the left of that curve. But what we're in danger of creating, or ending up with, is a bimodal distribution curve, where we're going to see some people on the far right-hand side who are highly remunerated and generally in the creative jobs of the future, creativity jobs. And then we're going to see a very sharp spike on the left as people are immiserated, right, forcing them into lower skilled jobs and a huge downward pressure on wages in that sector. And they're not going to be automated as quickly simply because they're going to produce so cheaply that it's not worth the investment to automate some of those jobs. That's not an acceptable scenario for anybody, I should think. And I want to say, too, that I'm very reticent about UBI. I'm very reticent about a universal basic income. Yes, I would support it if that's the only option, but I come from a working class background. I was actually a high school dropout at one point. My friends are mostly on the dole today with whom I grew up, and their sense of purpose and identity is under assault. I have 2 nephews who have just been through heroin rehab, and don't think that the current situation of the white working class is something that we want to expand into the experience of the rest of the society. So I would submit that people need to feel that they have meaningful, engaged work in order to be fulfilled human beings. And so how do we reconstitute that center of the bell curve? That's our task. I would submit that what we can create and what we are actually probably in the process of creating willy-nilly, but that we can do a better job if we are intentional about it, is the creating, curating, caring economy. The creating, caring, curating economy. Now, if we're going to lose 47% of jobs in the next 20 years, I went back, I'm co-authoring a book with Greg Topo on these issues. Greg Topo is senior editor at USA Today. And much smarter than I am and a better writer than I am, so I'm happy to just be along for the ride. But one of the things that we found in our research was, I asked the question as an historian, where did we see precisely 47% of jobs eliminated? And it was very convenient. In 1880, in the census, 89% of Americans were still involved in agrarian production. Okay? In 1980, exactly a century later, 2% of Americans were involved in agrarian production, precisely a 47% decline. But that was a century that we had to make that transformation. Now, if you think about an economy of creators, curators, and caring professions, that may seem difficult to fund, but I would submit to you that if you ask Thomas Jefferson 2 centuries ago today, in 1817, can you envisage a society where not only most people, only 2%, now it's 1% of people produce food, and far, far fewer than half of the people actually produce even material goods. They're just providing services to each other, giving each other haircuts and financial advice. He would have thought that was absolutely inconceivable and nonsensical. And so we're actually at a point where I think it's very easy to see how if we have our material conditions being able to be provided by machines, and even our intellectual production increasingly being able to be provided by AI bots, then we can have the wherewithal to have people taking care of each other in their interior and social needs. So let me play with these three aspects. Creative jobs I'm not going to speak at great length about because we all hear so much about the creative economy. Happy to elaborate on it, but I think that we have plenty of literature for that. Curating is an area that I haven't really seen many people talk about, but I'm increasingly interested in the issues of ethics, values, and AI. So one of the things that I recently founded is an annual global summit that will begin next September in Newport, Rhode Island. I founded it with the Episcopal Bishop of Rhode Island, and we're going to have a technology theology global summit every year in Newport. And actually, it looks like the Naval War College in Newport will be joining us in that as well. So these are issues that are very interesting and to me, but I think they have actual pragmatic impact. So for instance, as we look at AI going forward, I would say that we are going to need three areas of curation of our algorithms. The first is in the area of input. We're going to have to be thinking about what we want those algorithms to be working on. Right? Only humans can decide that this AI, whether it's narrow, broad, or even general AI, if we get toward mid-century and later, whether it should be making a better bridge or a cure for cancer. Right? Only humans can determine those inputs. And we're going to be curating that together. And there will be professionals who participate in the discussion. But even beyond that, there's going to need to be a curation about the values that inform the ways in which we ask the AI to proceed. A good friend of mine is Nick Bostrom, and he's written, Nick has created for himself the best job title on the planet. He is the executive director of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. I'm very jealous. And Nick's written a wonderful book called Superintelligence, and you've probably heard the pronouncements from Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk about slowing down on our research into AI because of existential threats to humanity and/or civilization. And that's actually all Nick's work. Nick organized that group and has been sort of feeding them his hesitation around AI. But Nick points out that only 7 people in the world are working full time on asking the question of what are the values that we want the AI programs to have as they become increasingly powerful. And there are hundreds of thousands of people rushing to get us to generalized AI as fast as possible. And so I think that this is an opportunity for an educational engagement of 50 million students crowdsourcing the question around the world. What values do we want the future big computer, you can ask it in a non-threatening way, what values do you want the future big computer to know about what it is to be human? And that would be not just an interdisciplinary discourse across the planet, it would be omnidisciplinary. You could do it K through 12, and it would be omnicultural. And I would submit that crowdsourcing is actually one of the least used powerful new educational tools that we have in our toolkit today. People just haven't been able to build pedagogies that leverage that. And I think this is a great opportunity to do that with people like Nick Bostrom. At any rate, yes. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought somebody asked something. At any rate, the next level of curation, the second level of curation is securing our precious AI algorithms, right? We're going to have to protect them. And we see that emerging in cybersecurity. So that's a field that is developing. At the other end, there's a field that doesn't even exist yet. And I think it's going to be crucially important because I don't trust our ability to predetermine what the values are for the AI. This is something Nick and I disagree on. Over lunch, we kind of went at each other. And argument was, as we get toward broad AI and certainly toward generalized AI, if by definition, deep AI and then superintelligence are on the one hand equal to human intelligence and then superior to human intelligence, why can it not reprogram any programming that we put into it, right? At the speed of light, incidentally. So I think we're going to have a little gap between what the computer tells us should be the path forward on any given problem that we set to it, and when we actually instrumentalize that proposal. And in the interstice of that gap, that's where humans need to reside. And so, an obvious example, an extreme example, but merely to prove the point in extremis, is if we ask an algorithm what is the most efficacious way to solve global warming, it might, while not sharing our anthropocentric chauvinism, it might very well say, eliminate humans, right? You get right to the solution. That would be, suboptimal from our perspective. And so clearly you would need a human curating the interstice between the algorithm's conclusion and when we actually operationalize that. Now that's an extreme example, of course, but I would envision that we're going to see, even on quotidian, prosaic problems day to day, there are going to be people who need to curate in that gap. Where are the unintended consequences for humans and society in this outcome? And that's a field that doesn't exist. A huge area will be caring jobs. And this is what I want to dwell on a bit. There's some really wonderful work that's been done by a father-son team by the name of Daniel and Richard Susskind at Oxford University. They've written a book called The Future of the Professions. And they argue that we're going to see the traditional professions eliminated, but that there are going to be two consequences of that. One is that we're going to actually see the delivery of services to human beings improve in terms of quality and empathy and accessibility and democratization of skills available to people. And at the same time, we're going to have new definitions of what it is to be in the medical, legal, and other professions that are focused on empathic capacity, not intellectual acumen per se. And I think that's a very interesting and incisive analysis. So let me just play with that for a moment. The Suskins would argue that if you go forward 20 years, 25 years, the most powerful medical clinician on the planet is going to be some progeny of Watson, right? And what we think of as a almost apotheosized enshrinement of the structure of the professions that we have inherited as an episteme from the 18th and 19th centuries as the most efficient way that we could possibly organize human knowledge and deliver services to people in, say, the medical profession, is in fact highly inefficient. That the best 100 clinicians on the planet today are only accessible to a handful of people, and at that, the most privileged. And that on top of that, it's only by random happenstance that they might have been selected to be the best clinicians and diagnosticians, but they might also be good treating people, right? Quite often, those are quite divergent sets, right? As we know, the best clinician notoriously doesn't have the best bedside manner. So what they envisage is that we're going to see a huge disruption to that industry, yes. But now 9 billion people, 25 years from now, will have access at negligible cost to the best diagnostician on the planet. And what we'll have as the intermediary will not be people who are selected and trained and empowered in their clinical skills, but people who have, and this is very important for thinking about education, people who have medical facility, people who have medical literacy, but not necessarily clinical fluency. And they are selected for their capacity, their innate capacity for empathy, and then they are trained to deepen the representation of those traits in their practice. So you will go to a medical facility, Watson 3.2000 will tell you what's wrong with you, and then an empathic medical practitioner will explain that to you. But bear in mind that that person doesn't need to be the top mind intellectually in the knowledge profession. Is selected for other traits. And if you think about it, there's almost a limitless need for humans caring for humans. I think our last session spoke to that most eloquently, but think about gerontology, think about more social service organizations, more nurturers, K through 12, more emotional counselors. These will be, I think, the new major profession to reconstitute that center of the bell curve. Just going to touch on a couple of areas, and then I'll open up for Q&A. First of all, we can, should, and must have enlightened, proactive, informed government policy that is built around these insights. Government, while it's not fashionable today, government not only must, but always has shaped the future of our economic system. The Erie Canal, which I mentioned. Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 to 1866 was, as a ratio of GDP, the largest government giveaway, largesse, to the private sector in the history of our country, and it clearly shaped the future of the country, right? Including the fact that because the first one was in 1862, they decided on the northern rather than the southern route, which made a big difference in the economic development of those sectors across the country. That was a government decision. The Federal Aid Highway Acts of 1955 and 56. In 1955, dollars spent $26 billion to construct a 41,000-mile highway system. And think about the economic impact of that as opposed to, say, building a public transportation system with comparable intent. So government always has made these decisions. The issue is not public policy versus no public policy. The issue is enlightened public policy versus benighted public policy. And there are so many things that can be done. I would submit that the government should be incentivizing the development of cobots, that we should be seeing more robots that are built to complement and augment human skills and input and labor rather than to eliminate and render obsolete human input. And this is quite possible to be done. In fact, there's strong evidence that it's highly efficient. Everybody knows that Kasparov was beaten by Deep Blue. What's less recognized is that a grandmaster with a computer can beat either alone because they approach the problem in complementary but disparate ways, right? The machine mind just crunches numbers going forward, and the human mind has intuition, surprise, and so forth. And if you want a marvelous example of this, if you're a chess geek, do go back and go over once again Bobby Fischer's 13-year-old game of the century with his queen sacrifice, which is still sublime, gorgeous, and astonishing to watch. Eric Brynjolfsson at MIT discusses this in terms of running with the machines rather than against the machines. Julie Shaw at MIT, she oversees the interactive robotics group there, and she's doing wonderful work on exploring ways that people can have robots that are inceptionally, foundationally predicated on how do we optimize the complementarity with humans rather than trying to just plow them under in the work world. Gina Neff, who's one of my favorite thinkers on these subjects today, she's at Oxford University. She has shown the ways in which this is possible to be done in the construction industry. And having come from a working class background, I'm very, very interested in how these ideas can be transformed into workforce development in the perhaps semi-skilled sectors. And Gina's done wonderful work there. But Gina also makes a very important point that I think is lost in much of the discourse. She says that there is a clear distinction between entrepreneurship and innovation. We talk far too much about making everybody an entrepreneur, whereas in fact, only 1%, 2%, or 3% of people would wisely have the qualities to be entrepreneurs. We're doing people a disservice if we try to make them all entrepreneurs. But 100% of people can, should, and must be innovators. And I've taken a lot of tours of factories in my research into workforce development, and it seems to me that that's implicitly, at least, what Six Sigma or lean management is saying, is that even the factory floor operative is empowered and engaged and successful when that factory operative is part of a team that is engaged in continual improvement, right? Which is really everybody can be an innovator. There are other ways that government can help. When I talk with CEOs, they tell me consistently that one of the hardest things they find is getting the right skill that they need for a particular, sometimes temporary program that they're developing. And one CEO told me, well, I found somebody in Albania of all places, but there's no way I can get them through immigration. And so the challenge is that for any individual business, it is too cost prohibitive to skill somebody up for a rather arcane skill, and they may only need that person for 3 months or 6 months. On top of that, the person might leave for greener pastures. And so government can pool resources in both the public and the private sector to skill people up so that they're available for these gig opportunities with different companies at the highest skill levels and emergent skills, and also should create some form, and I'm not advocating any particular form, but some form of portable health care so that even the highest skilled workers can be peripatetic and itinerant in the gig economy. I think this would be immensely more efficient for businesses. Education is my field, and I'm just going to actually touch on it very briefly because I'd love to talk about it all day, but I would say that we need to stop training for the knowledge economies. We need to start thinking about shifting from content mastery to content literacy and application mastery. Application mastery. And at my school, Rocky Hill School, we've gone through a 2-year process where, as a collective community, parents, teachers, students, and trustees, we have engaged in a thoroughgoing discourse with thought leaders from around the world to envision what is the most exciting K through 12 environment we can create, reverse engineering from our current understanding of where this iterative process is taking us. We came up with 8 essential competencies. None of them will shock you, but I think that they're all important. We've determined that a Rocky Hill student is a navigator, critical thinker, citizen, and communicator who is innovative, self-aware, ethical, and globally minded. And as part of implementing this, we have partnered with Boston's premier education technology incubator and accelerator, LearnLaunch, just down the street. And we currently have, just this semester, 11 LearnLaunch EdTech companies that are embedded at Rocky Hill School, beta testing in their own K-12 test bed. And our students are sitting alongside real entrepreneurs in the product development of real education technology software and gaining a very sophisticated gestalt of what it is to be innovative, iterative, an entrepreneur, think about market dynamics, you name it. And they're doing this K through 12. And I'll, if I have a chance, ask me about Jerry the Bear with our 3rd graders, which is an AI bear that can be tested for diabetes for children who have juvenile diabetes. And they can play with Jerry the Bear and draw his blood, and Jerry will help them work it out. And our 3rd grade students actually came up with the idea of, because there are no flies on these 3rd graders, I'll tell you. They were like, yeah, Jerry the Bear is really cool, but it still hurts to get a shot. And so now they've bridged with somebody in Atlanta who is a pediatrician who is trying to come up with a painless shot with Buzzy the Bee. And now they're actually Skyping them together, and they're coming up with a new Jerry the Bear and the painless shot. Those are 3rd graders working with entrepreneurs. We similarly have an innovator in residence, K through 12. And I am just in discussions with one of the co-founders of Singularity University, who has gone on to do extraordinary things like found She Works and Women at the Frontier with the Clinton Foundation. She's an amazing person. Looks like she's going to be our permanent innovator in residence, permanently there at the school, K through 12, 30 hours a week. We have artists in residence who are joining us from Alex and Ani, who will not only help our students think about their creative endeavors, but how they can turn that into successful pathways to careers. And I'm going to conclude by saying that we, in addition to the 8 essential capacities, are thinking about other qualities of mind that we think will be very helpful. We believe that we need to give students the grit, persistence, and resilience, adaptability to be able to put in the 10,000 hours that it takes to become a master of whatever your passion is, but then have the skill set to stand in front of a group of people and give a 10-minute TED Talk that conveys the essentials of that 10,000 hours of learning in a compelling 10-minute presentation. We believe that we can actually inculcate in students comfort with accelerating change. That you can teach students comfort with accelerating change. That you can teach students capacity for concentrated linear rational thought amid electronic distractions. And that you can teach civility and ethics in a technological civilization. We are living through the big history moment in which we largely leave the prior economies of agriculture, industrialism, and service industry behind. We're going to do so in a 25-year period. With informed and enlightened government policy and educational reprogramming, we can successfully transition to the creative, curating, caring economy. But we are pressed for time. And failure or lassitude will guarantee convulsive shocks that we have only just begun to feel. Thank you.
So, thank you. We have time for about 2 questions, and then we're going to go to break. So I know there's probably more than 2 questions. So I just, yeah, everyone run them over. Yes, exactly.
Can we all go to Rocky?
Yeah, I'm struck by how dystopian your view of the future is. I'm wondering if you could unpack a little bit your claim that only 2% of people can be entrepreneurs, and then maybe apply some of your predictions to your own institution. So which half of your staff won't be there in 25 years at the Rocky Hill School?
I don't see my vision as dystopian at all. I think it's just, I'm shocked that you would think it's dystopian. If I were standing here in 1817 and saying that over the next 150 years, 47% of the current people working in agriculture would no longer be working in agriculture, I wouldn't see that as dystopian. I would see that as saying we're entering the S-curve of a transition. Let's think about how we're going to curate this. Let's think about how we're going to have optimal outcomes. And actually, human well-being is improved. You know, the story that I told about the scenario of 9 billion people having access to the best clinician on the planet and being then cared for by an intermediary who is trained for empathy, I think that's an improvement in the human lot. So I'm actually fairly optimistic. Well, then that's where I'm trying to say that I think that we can create an economy that is predicated upon people working, and we need to think deeply and trenchantly about what those jobs can be. So I actually see myself in this talk not as pessimistic in the least. I think I'm realistic as an historian. I think we would be naive in the extreme if we didn't see that we're living through a time of liminal accelerated change that's going to be disruptive. And I would posit Antonio Gramsci's great comment, pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. We can do this. All of them will be there because they're already in the caring economy. You know, it's a false question I would submit, because they're already in the caring economy. I think I would rather be a K through 12 educator right now than a college president. Next question.
Thank you. Great talk. My name is John Landry. You're in a space. Thank you, Jim. I'm done. I actually think I'm more dystopian than you are. And the reasons are partly involved in something you said that I guess I wouldn't agree with, and that is using the Kasparov Big Blue, Deep Blue system as an analog to what's going on. That was a system that was created specifically to play chess. It was algorithmic. You had to have both chess players and brilliant algorithm makers in order to do that. The more threatening example is the Go story out of DeepMind, which was algorithms that essentially provide machine learning. And the machine learning is where the fear comes in. Because if you follow that story, and you can see wonderful YouTube videos on this, on Go being one of the most complex games ever played, where this system learned how to play it.
Yeah.
And not only did it learn how to play it by watching the grandmasters and playing against them and continuing to learn, but then it started making its own games up so that it could randomize and essentially learn things that have never been seen before. That's a super intelligence story.
Yes.
That is a really threatening story, I think, much
Absolutely.
more so than the analog to Deep Blue. Do you want to comment on that?
Please, yes, and thank you. That's spot on. I totally agree. And, you know, for the sake of a 45-minute talk, I was trying to really just keep it to a few sort of strata of focal points. But I heartily agree. And in the book that Greg and I are writing, we're looking very, very much at that. And I think that, again, what I'm suggesting here in terms of what might be jobs for the future do not require that people actually be working with the bots, right? So what Greg and I are doing is saying, look, let's think about a diachronic progression of how this might play out with intellectual humility about our opaqueness looking into the future, right? But let's think about, can we build, for instance, an educational system today that teaches the traits that students will need almost any of those scenarios playing out that we can envisage, right? Is there a commonality of what we should be teaching today? And we think that creativity, innovation, empathy, and comfort with accelerating change are going to be germane no matter what. And I heartily agree with you. I think that if we think out 20 years, then we can, or maybe 10 to 15 years, then it makes sense to run with the bots, right? If we're thinking out 30, 40 years, then we have to be aware that we might actually be eliminated as intellectual producers to our own artifice. And but
There goes that
But we-
cornucopia.
But we still will need people who can be creative, right? Who can be curators of the outcomes, the inputs, the safety and the outcomes of those AI programs. And we'll certainly need more people who are caring for other human beings. And so that's why I'm trying to ask myself, I would submit to you that when I talked about running with the bots and cobots, I see that actually as an interim diachronic stage that's going to itself be rendered obsolete within the lifetimes of these students.